Please come in, and welcome back for the second part of the Luxembourg Sustainability Forum 2022. I hope you followed what we've been trying to do with you for the last 2 hours. We first set the scene. We set the scene about what's happening around, not only Luxembourg, but widely worldwide, with some dramatic images and music to really get you to feel where we were standing. And please join Inter, please, don't worry. Just join the gradin, allez-y. And clearly after that, what we've been doing is kind of trying to analyze what's happening in our minds. We were making a pulse about what's happening in Luxembourg. We were trying to understand as well the new notions of solastalgia. We switched to eco-anxiety. We got testimonies about how it works, how to deal with that. And then we did something which I find important, is trying to kill this phenomenon of the big complot, complotism, and this is not true, etc., and to explain how it works. Now that we've been doing that we took all that path, I think it's important now to switch from those emotions to motion. It's important now to understand what we can do. And it's my pleasure and honor to introduce he's a tall man, but he's a very important person in the world of sustainability. He's one of the most known persons in the world on this topic, John Elkington. As Marie mentioned a few minutes ago, is the guy who invented this notion of triple P, people, planet, prosperity, or profit. To give you also an idea of who he is, he's been named 4th in international survey about the top 100 CSR leader. And he was 4th after people like Al Gore, Barack Obama, or Anita Roddick, just to give you an idea. He got last year also the World Sustainability Award, just to give you an idea. He's been helping an incubate movement like the B Team, the Dow Jones Sustainability Indexes, the Global Reporting Initiative, the B Lab UK, etc., etc. And his main idea is that it is time to reset capitalism. And you can see here on the slide, is kind of talking about the regenerative capitalism. And I think it's going to be very interesting to listen to what John has to tell us. I'd like to take a pause and to really thank also the British Chamber of Commerce, who's been partnering with us to get John here in Luxembourg. I mean, it's not always easy to get so famous people to be in Luxembourg, and it is the first time of John in Luxembourg. Can you imagine? He's active for a few decades already in these fields, and it's the first time he's joining Luxembourg. So we are very proud to get John here in Luxembourg. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think it's time to give the floor to Mr. John Elkington. John, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Christian. Salut, bonjour, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to be here. My main emotion, I should say, is just joy to be among you. I'm wearing a tie, you may have noticed, and ties can lie. And the reason I'm wearing it is I've actually been working in this field now for 50 years this year. And I've worn a tie for a lot of the time that I've worked with business, particularly in boards and the corporate suites and so on. And the reason is, the fewer signals that you can give that you're different to people who are different, the better. And many people see business dress as a good start. These people are at least human. Many years ago, Greenpeace described us as Greenpeace in pinstripes or in a business suit. So I'm thrilled to be here. I'm going to talk about some reasons why I think we can be a little less gloomy, although I have to say I'm quite often depressed about the way this world of ours seems to be going. And just some of the presentations we've already had today, I think, confirm some of that. I'm going to talk about the public response. You've had a lot on that. I'm going to do just a couple of slides on that and explaining how that flashes into the world of business in particular. I'm going to talk about what we call the U-bend. I mean, you all know your plumbing well enough to know that there's a bit under your sink where things get stuck. Well, that's where we are increasingly. We're stuck, and the world order that we knew is beginning to come apart. And my sense is that's going to accelerate. And that's feeding into this sort of ESG, environment, social, governance sort of feeding frenzy where everyone wants to have an ESG fund, but there's pushback building, and I'll talk a little bit about that. I'm going to talk about swans, and for me, swans are exponential, either problems or exponential solutions. A little bit about that. And I'm going to say why I think this next period, 2030, early 2030s, is going to be so transformational. So that's what's to expect. And I just, following on from what Christian said about the British Chamber of Commerce, they were set up 30 years ago. So, you know, happy birthday to them, and thank you for helping get me here. But when I think about 1992, which was the year of the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro, and I think back to how business then thought about the sorts of issues we've been discussing today. Largely it was run by technical people, people with job titles like environment manager. It was extremely rare that you ever got through to CEOs and boards and so on. So I'm not going to go very far back, but at least in that sort of 30-year time scale, I'll sort of move back and forth. But then, what about the future? What about taking 30 years into the future? And 10 years ago, I worked with Jürgen Randers. Some of you will know him as part of the Limits to Growth team. And he did a book called 2052. And the chapter that I contributed there was not on business. It was on the military. It was on defense. It was on security. And the reason was I felt many of these issues are in the process of flashing over into that world. So I did a session about 18 months ago with admirals, with generals, at the UK Ministry of Defence, and they're extremely concerned about migration and all the sort of issues that we've touched on today. So, I don't know how you think about all of this, but there are some people think that technology will save us. And I was saying last night, I was reading on the plane here a book by Douglas Rushkoff. Some of you may have bought it or hopefully at least heard of it, and it's called The Survival of the Richest. And it is indeed about how the billionaires are starting to look about where their bunkers go for this event that they increasingly sense is coming. And so when we talk about capitalism, we have to realize there are very different species of capitalists out there. I think that we will crack this problem. And the reason why I personally am more optimistic than I have been for about 30 years is because I think we could never have cracked these systemic challenges unless people had direct, immediate experience of things not working at the systemic level. And increasingly that is a shared sense. So just firstly, a few comments around this question of who cares about all this. And some of you will have seen this extraordinary announcement or pronouncement by Stuart Kirk at HSBC, a major bank, where he basically said, who cares about if Florida goes underwater? Who cares? We don't. The financial markets don't, because we are looking 6 to 7 years into the future. He did us a kindness. He did us a service by flagging up something at a time when many financial institutions are saying that they do care and they have these wonderful strategies and all the rest of it. He lost his job in the process, as you will know. But I do think he did us a service, because people so often in this space do not tell the truth. And we need people increasingly to tell the truth, to be honest. And that goes back to Stefan's presentation and sort of the false facts challenges that we increasingly face. So how brave is it in the midst of all of that you have a UN Secretary General standing up and saying these sorts of words? I won't read the slide, but you will have seen him subsequently talk about public relations agencies and basically saying not exactly that they're criminals, but they've aided and abetted the climate criminals for a very long period of time. The UN would never have done that historically. And again, I think it is this sense of building all around us that this is a systemic crisis. I think the crisis is affecting capitalism. I think it's increasingly affecting democracy. And I think longer term it will also affect sustainability. I do not think the sustainability agenda as it is currently articulated and designed is fit for purpose. We really need to evolve it, and quite considerably. This is one of the problems. Many of you will know Singularity University. You've seen slides like this. And the basic point is that our brains were never configured to deal with exponentials. We just don't do that well. And yet, that's what's starting to happen all around us. And I often go back, as people in Silicon Valley do, to a book that I haven't read for about 50 years, which was The Sun Also Rises by Ernest Hemingway. And some of you will remember there's a line in there where one of the main characters is asked, "How did you go bankrupt?" And the answer was gradually, then suddenly. And that's exactly where we are in so many different areas now. Things that have been creeping up on us for a very, very long time are suddenly becoming very present and imminent. So this is the U-bend, and this is a diagram I put together 5 or 6 years ago. And at the bottom, what you will see, there is a zone where people get increasingly agitated, increasingly worried, increasingly angry. And in many ways, that's the world, those are the emotions into which populists are tapping. COVID-19 and its variants has actually both exaggerated some of those concerns, because they've shown that governments are very often not entirely up to these sorts of systemic challenges. But also, I think it's sort of encouraged people to believe that science can be useful. And for a long time, the belief and interest in science was declining. I think that is critical. And then we've had the invasion, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And I think one of the things that's happened as a result of that is you suddenly hear a different S word everywhere: security. We're talking about energy security. We're talking about food security. We're talking about climate security. You name it, it's now got a security spin on it, which is one of the reasons why I think those admirals and generals were so interested. And we're seeing some wonderful trip-ups among politicians. So Scott Morrison, who is a man I loathe, was Prime Minister of Australia. You may remember him coming into the Parliament and holding up a lump of coal which had been coated so that it didn't stain his hands, and saying, "This is the future." And he has just been, as you will all know, booted out of office by Tony Albanese. And entirely the shift has been based on social and environmental factors. So the political dimensions of all this are starting to become quite real. And Australia's now signed up to climate agreements among that. In addition to which, you have, for example, the United States, which has been a very long holdout on climate, starting to build elements of this into the Inflation Recovery Act, which I think is potentially very exciting indeed. Let me now just talk about this ESG moment, if I can call it that, but it's a feeding frenzy in many ways. In 1991, I asked a Financial Times cartoonist, Ingram Pinn, to draw this diagram for me. And it was a very simple theme. Basically, I asked him, I want you to show a boardroom, and I want you to show 3 characters. One was the fish in the business suit, for nature, for environment, for sustainability in a way. One was the woman representing the dispossessed, the poor. You know, we've heard about climate refugees and so on. And the third was a bit of a joke. It was the robot for the long-term future. Well, it's no longer a joke, as some of you will know. The first expert system, not a robot, but an expert system, was appointed to a board in 2014 in Hong Kong. I was told last night at dinner that a robot has just been appointed as CEO of a gaming company. Well, I don't know how far this trend is going to go, and I think a lot of it may, again, be robot washing or something like that. But one of the things I did, and maybe I just very quickly go back there. I can't go back. I won't. In 2018, I did what the Harvard Business Review said was the first ever product recall of an idea. So I did a product recall for the triple bottom line. And the idea was that, not that it was a stupid idea. Some people thought that if you did a product recall, you meant the product was dead. And I've worked with enough automotive companies, Ford, Volvo, Toyota, and so on, to know that that's not the reality. You recall a product because there's something wrong with it, and you fix that, and then you put it out there again. But And that wasn't in any sense a reflection on the B corporation world, which is completely configured around these sorts of multiple dimension value creation equations and so on. ESG is the same, but it's not exactly the same. And so clearly it's got the governance piece in it now. And you're starting to see something really incredibly interesting set to squabbles, conflicts. Elon Musk, who loves a good fight, when Tesla was dropped from the Standard & Poor's 500 listing, done by the Dow Jones Sustainability Indexes, as were, was absolutely appalled. How could a company that had disrupted the automotive and mobility sectors be dropped from a rating system like that? And he was particularly appalled, as some of you will remember. ExxonMobil was brought into the rating system at the same time. And there is an eco-criminal, if there ever was. Well, we can get into that in debate, but I mean, they really have lobbied for a very long time to shut up climate scientists and so on. And then you have magazines, journals, newspapers, they call themselves, like The Economist, looking at the ESG sector and basically trying to take it apart, basically saying, it's been a wonderful ride, but now let's try something different. They're basically saying that there are different components of ESG. We've got to be more aware of those. I agree with that. Wasn't it striking that when the EU taxonomy came in, something like $2 trillion worth of assets had to drop that ESG tag because they didn't properly meet the bill. That's just an indication of the ESG washing that may be out there. But the way I see ESG is it's a necessary and really important, in fact, it's a crucial stepping stone towards something different, which is around system change. And I think what it's encouraging the financial world in particular to do is to look into all of this, understand to some degree a lot of this, and pull in people who are trained in all of that. And I cannot but see that as a positive. Now, just very quickly, this swans area. Most of you will have read Nassim Nicholas Taleb's book, The Black Swan. You will remember that it came out in 2007, which was the same year that Inspiring More Sustainability, IMS, was founded. And it was a very important book for many of us. And what it was very successful in doing was not just calling out the fact that there were risks in the financial markets, which then very rapidly became very apparent, but it was classifying, categorizing, describing some of those big systemic challenges that we face. And basically, Taleb was saying, these things come out of the blue, we don't expect them. They have an off-the-scale impact. I mean, COVID would have been an example. And then we sit down afterwards and we try and understand what's just happened to us. And very often we fail to properly understand. So we set ourselves up to fail again. Now, he's been repeatedly asked, as many of you will know, was COVID-19 a black swan? And he tends to say, no, it really wasn't. We saw it. We saw coronavirus epidemics coming. We set up units to assess all of these sorts of risks. We very often shut them down. We published reports. No one particularly paid very much attention. And I think exactly the same characteristics are now also true of the climate debate. Now, I'm going to go positive, but I just wanted to sort of set the scene. So for me, a green swan is an exponential solution to some of the big challenges that the Sustainable Development Goals characterize. So they are climate, they are environmental, but they're in many other sectors as well. The Bank of International Settlements thinks that green swans are solely to do with climate change, and that's fine, but I see them as wider. So, for example, the EU sort of Green Deal, for me, we'll see how it plays out properly over time, but is an example of a green swan. People putting on their business cards, I mean, people send me pictures of their business cards from countries like Indonesia, and they have green swan or green swan manager or whatever, and that's lovely. But that's not the intention. These things are meant to be much bigger than the individual level response. So what do we do when we recall the triple bottom line, the 3 Ps, people, planet, profit, or prosperity? Well, we started to think, why were we so uncomfortable with the way that the triple bottom line was being expressed in different parts of the world? And the answer, it took us about 18 months to get there, but then it took me about 18 months to get to the triple bottom line in the first place, is expressed in these diagrams, which is that at any one point, in our societies, in our worlds, in our realities, we're working with multiple horizons. And many of you will know different multiple horizon models. McKinsey have one. But this is one by Bill Sharp. And what it shows is, at the top on the left, a world that we've all grown up in, we all take for granted. It dates back, for example, to the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944, Marshall Plan, all of that, the UN institutions. My view is that that's coming apart, and it's coming apart at an accelerating rate. And the question is then, what is going to replace that over time? Longer term, and this goes to the promise of regenerative capitalism, where you have companies like Walmart, you have companies like Unilever, PepsiCo, all making these sort of, we're going to be regenerative statements, and particularly at CEO level. In the longer term, we will see capitalism becoming more regenerative. It will have no choice but to move in that direction, to evolve in those sorts of ways. But in the middle ground, we've got the stuff that has been often reflected on during these discussions today, which is the word that I've heard more than even security in recent years has been resilience. You're talking to CEOs, you're talking to CFOs, you're talking to investors, you're talking to government people, politicians, and so on. And they are absolutely crucially nervous about the resilience of the systems that they're trying to manage. The only way, longer term, that you can ensure the resilience of complex systems, they could be economies, they could be societies or communities, they could be our climate, they could be our biosphere, is you regenerate them. You invest in the long-term improvement of exactly those systems. And if you ask me where the leaders are currently in all of this, that's about the best that we can see in the world that we track at the moment. So final few slides, and this is on the years through into the early 2030s, a period where I don't think we have any option but to transform the way that we design our business models, that we design our investment portfolios, we design our sort of policy frameworks as governments and so on. And the sort of language on this slide, business transformation, that sort of language is increasingly heard in the business world. And I think one of the things I often say to CEOs is, you cannot do this on your own. However much you want to transform your business model, you are going to need support from policymakers to make this viable in the long term. If nothing else, to clean up the sort of the free riders, the cowboys, and so on. And I spent a couple of days from Sunday in Finland with Neste, which used to be the state-owned oil enterprise, and now as fast as it possibly can is coming out into circular materials, sustainable aviation fuels, and so on. And it's astonishing to see how many of these companies there now are, and it's immensely, I find, exciting. Let me just finish off with a couple of slides on Acciona, and then another one. One of the things we've done recently is to work with a Spanish infrastructure and renewable energy company called Acciona. They're a family-owned business. They invited us to work with 27 of their younger executives, which goes back to an earlier theme today. And the brief was simple. Develop us a 5-year sustainability strategy. So we spent 6 months with them, and at the end of that, their answer was no. We're not going to develop a 5-year sustainability strategy. This has to be at least for 10 years, and it has to be for the business as a whole. And it has to be around regeneration, not just sort of loosely defined sustainability. And it was been fascinating. A couple of weeks ago in São Paulo, I visited an Acciona project where they're digging immense tunnels for a new subway line, But the social side of that includes, for example, recruiting women from the favelas, the slums, and training them up to the point where they can then go out into the wider world and find constructive employment. There are two slides which I must go through just very quickly. A lot of companies are dealing with this as something that they can do through citizenship, reporting, stakeholder engagement, supply chain management, and the rest of it. I don't know how many of you have been noticing the way in which major companies like Ford are starting to announce they're splitting the business. So they're now going from an integrated company to a business that has two different operating parts. One is going to focus on the legacy internal combustion engine part of the business, and the new bit is going to focus on electric vehicles and everything that goes with that. Immensely exciting. Then closer to home, Solvay. Again, splitting in two. One, a legacy business, basically a cash cow, and then the new piece playing into lightweighting, circular economy, all of these sorts of different areas. So again, immensely exciting. And I just want to end with a set of questions that I constantly ask myself. And that is, if you could bring future generations, maybe young people are a proxy for the moment, into these sorts of conversations that we're having, and ask them, what would they vote for? What would they vote against in today's world? What would they invest in? What would they want to sell? Who would they work for and why? And who would they not work for? And what would they want us to know these days? And one of the books I read recently was Bella Lack's book, Children of the Anthropocene. Highly recommended, because she went right around the world talking to younger champions of change. And it's a stunning book. I find it very impressive. Any questions that don't get asked now, I put up my email there. I answer every email. My emotion now is curiosity to see what comes out of the next stage of this process. But Christian, if I could hand back to you, I'd be very grateful. Thank you very much, everyone.
Stay with us, stay with us. Well, I think we have the opportunity maybe to discuss a little bit with John for a few minutes. So I'm sure it has been triggering a lot of questions in everybody's mind. I know sometimes it's very hard to ask a question. There must be mics around. So if someone has a question, you're more than welcome to raise your hand, and we're going to bring you a mic immediately.
And it can be as rude as you like.
Come on, I'm sure it's no question of daring. Ah, look at that.
Thank you. Just on the last slide, quick question.
Yes.
We see the recent elections, unfortunately, going towards conservatives. Sweden, Italy, Brazil. It's not clear if Lula will win. So is this awakening actually happening? Because otherwise, the progressive agenda should be actually stronger. Even in the US, it's not actually given that the conservative will not be back in power with the midterm elections. So would you actually see that, going back to the last slide, for who the young people will vote?
I don't yet know. That's a horrible question, and thank you for it. And in the sense, if anyone here has a really good answer, I'd love to hear from them. But my view is that every 70 or 80 years, we go through one of these cycles where people lose confidence in the system as a whole and its ability to do what they want it to do. And you get these periods of populism, and almost always you get a war in the middle of it. And some people will look at what's going on in Ukraine at the moment and say, that's the war. It isn't, I don't think. I think there is a much bigger conflict, at least in prospect there. So to your question, I could quite easily say, people aren't stupid and they'll sort of reject some of these right-wing populists over time, but I think it's going to take too long. And I think it's already interfering with the sustainability agenda. There are already examples of, I was meant to speak at a conference in Brazil in a few weeks, and the corporate sponsors just pulled out because they thought Lula was going to win. and then I see that he may not, and they don't want to be on the wrong side of that one when it goes through. So I think my conclusion is that our agenda is now becoming, whether we like it or not, immensely more political. And we've all got to become immensely more political and work out how we're going to drive the appropriate changes. And it's not just writing letters to MPs or whatever it might be. We've got to come together in very different coalitions and alliances and really push the political system. Will we do it? Will we achieve it in the next 2 or 3 years? I don't think we will. But if you ask me sort of the next 7 to 10 years, I think we might, and we have to.
Thank you, John. Question, Laurent?
But I'd love to continue the conversation over a drink later on.
Thank you, John. One question. What would be the key enablers, according to you, for the green swan?
Yeah. Thank you. For me, as I said, green swans are exponential solutions, and there are all sorts of drivers that potentially take us in that direction. So, for example, I said a lot of people are thinking technology will save us. It won't. And what we're seeing is increasingly that many of these technologies are spraying out all sorts of issues that we'd never thought about because of who's doing the coding and all the rest of it. But if you look at whether it's artificial intelligence, whether it's synthetic biology, whether it's drones or whatever it is, suddenly there are many, many, many more of these digitally empowered technologies coming through at the same time and starting to recombine. And one group that I mentioned last night, but if you haven't heard of, I recommend incredibly highly, is called Rethink X. And they're based in Silicon Valley and they're based in London. They've done a series of studies on major sectors of industry. The first one that they looked at was transportation and mobility. And basically what they're predicting into the 2030s is a hugely disruptive period of change in that sector. And obviously we're getting a lot of hype about autonomous vehicles and so on. It's going to be rather harder to get there than some of these companies like Google expected. But what Rethink X saw happening in that market was a 50% increase in the kilometers that we all travel, 50% globally, and a 70% collapse in the revenues going to car makers and fossil fuel companies because of some of these deeper structural trends. They've seen the same trend happening, for example, but only in the United States was the focus of that study, with cattle ranching and dairying. And they're basically saying within 25 to 30 years, American farms will have 60% fewer animals on them because of precision fermentation. So you can make everything. You can make milk, you can make meat, you can make leather in much more effective ways through these technologies. So what I would say to you is and that's even before we get to energy, technology is going to be a really crucial element of all of this. But I also think, and I think it's something that you, Christian, and IMS are working on, education is the most important single investment that we make as a species. And I have heard people saying, we haven't got time to educate people. We've got all the time in the world. We've got to really radically accelerate that side of things. And I think last night you were saying you're planning to focus on students, people in professions now, and then older people. That's absolutely the way to go. So when I think about green swans, I think a whole series of them potentially can come out of putting all of us through a re-education sounds like Cambodia or Kampuchea, but some sort of process that changes the way we think. And I think, I love the design, incidentally, and I love the audience reaction, but this is part of that. And so any other suggestions that people have on what they would see to be green swans, would love to hear them.
We time for the last one. Yeah, I see a lady raising the hand over there. So if a mic could make his way up to there, that would be great. Let's take a few seconds. It's coming. Teamwork, perfect. Look at that. Here we go.
Thank you. Is it working?
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you for your speech. So today you're facing an audience mainly in the financial market, I would say. As we are not yet robot CEOs, what is the advice? What will be the 3 next steps that you would suggest that our CEOs perform for the generative future?
Thank you for the question. And all of you would have your own sort of 3 favorite suggestions. Mine would include getting out more. I think one of the things that's happened to us all during the lockdowns is we've got quite comfortable working away in our bedrooms and so on. I think CEOs have to go and see what is happening in the wider world, including, Doug McMillon of Walmart, as a CEO, made the commitment to turn Walmart into a regenerative company. I wonder how much he's sent his people out to visit regenerative farms and so on. I think that needs to be done. And we've seen examples of CEOs going to visit their competitors of the future and being absolutely shell-shocked by the implications of what these people are working on. One reaction I remember from the CEO of Daimler was, I've been briefed on this, I've read about it. This was even before we got to the EV breakthroughs. He said, I knew this stuff, but this is the first time, and he was basically greeted by the CEO of a tech company by saying, don't know why you're here. 10 years from now, you will not exist. So I think partly get out more. Secondly, bring elements of the outside world in. So it's easy to overestimate the power of non-executive directors, advisory boards, and so, but for having some of those people from the outside world, and not just the comfortable people, not just the people it's easy to talk with, that you know, and you know their family for the last 200 years, but people who are rabble-rousers, troublemakers, I mean, people like Joe, and younger people, pulling some of those in. That seems far-fetched, but at COP26 I went to a session where a company had a youth board come in and challenge their thinking, and I think that for me would be important. Final thing I would say is don't make assumptions, in the sense that CEOs have all got MBAs and they've had business school education and they talk to people like them, and they assume that the wider world is the world that they have understood and been taught about. But that world is changing, and I think one of the questions is, how do we get business schools to change what they do? And part of what CEOs can do is to instruct business schools where they're taking in people from particular companies to change what they teach. And that's a really, and if that works, that could be very powerful indeed. But again, over a drink, would love to sort of add to the list. There are lots of things that can be done. Thank you.
Well, John, thank you very much. Maybe to share something a little bit more private. Before joining here, I was asking John, are you still nervous? You've been in 1,000 conference. Are you still nervous to join? He said, no, the stress is almost gone, but I still feel responsible to convey a message. I can tell you, you conveyed it very well. At least I think I can sense this to the audience. So thank you very much again for joining us today, for your insights. Now, this is, you might think this is textbook, this is the experience of someone who's been working with boards, but is it really existing in practice? We're going to see in a few seconds examples of companies doing things. So next to come in a minute.